With only days until the election, domestic policy remains as much a concern for Americans as Iraq or national security. Joining me now, two leading economists, Paul Krugman and Robert Barro. Krugman is a professor of economics and international affairs at Princeton. He's also a columnist for the New York Times and author of the book, The Great Unraveling, which is now out, as you can see, in paperback. Robert Barro is a professor of economics at Harvard and columnist for Business Week magazine. The second edition of his book, Economic Growth, has recently been released by MIT Press. I am pleased to have both of them at this table. Are tax cuts for the rich good for economic growth? For those people who make, in this, using the political numbers of our time, people who make more than $200,000 a year?
Not if they add to a budget deficit. Not if they're, not if whatever arguments you can make for them are outweighed by the fact that it's adding to the amount of money the government is borrowing.
I'm trying to get at this question. So, what is the basic difference between the two of you with respect to where this economy is and what it needs?
We have differences about what's effective for the economy as well, but the biggest difference is value. I want to maintain the social insurance institutions. I want to maintain Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and I actually I want some further expansion of health insurance. So I say, look, we don't have enough revenue as is. I don't want more tax cuts that will further undermine the revenue base that makes it possible to have these programs that sand off some of the rough edges of capitalism. And Robert will have to talk for himself on how he wants it to go, but that's, basically, let me put it this way. If you're asking about the Bush tax cuts, is the criterion, is the economy in better shape now currently than it would be if nothing had been done? Probably. Are we better off?
In better shape if nothing had been done.
If there had been no stimulus program at all.
He didn't mean that.
No, I think that the economy, I think we got some stimulus out of these tax cuts.
I disagree with a lot of this because I think where we are now, which is actually quite a good economy, owes quite a bit to the 2003 tax cut plan. And I actually distinguish a lot between the 2003 and 2001 tax cut plans. They're really quite different. The big thing about the 2003 plan is that it didn't just dump money on people. It didn't just particularly give money to people. It increased incentives to do things. It did that particularly by accelerating the marginal income tax rate cuts. It did it by cutting some of the tax rates that pertain to saving. It motivated people to work more, to enhance productivity, to increase investment. It worked great. I mean, since early 2003, the economy has done extremely well. And I can't prove it for sure, but I think it's a very convincing case that tax cut in 2003 was a lot responsible for it.
But what about his basic argument that there is a different, in terms of value judgment here, in understanding distinctions between the two of you?
It's not on the first order of
philosophies.
A value judgment. I mean, I think mostly about how do you raise taxes in an efficient way? How do you maintain and stimulate?
Raise taxes or reduce taxes?
How do you collect revenue?
Right.
Excuse me. How do you collect tax revenues in an efficient way? How do you promote economic growth?
Right.
And the basic way you do that is you cut the taxes where they start out having the highest rates. Now, a lot of that at the moment is among the rich people. It used to be it was more at the poor people, but we've actually done a lot on that with respect to the earned income tax credit, so it's not so true now. But the way you really enhance the economy and make it work better is by cutting tax rates where they start out being the highest, because that's where the government is initially distorting the situation the most. And the reason I like the 2003 program is it basically did some of that.
I have to say, if you think that this is a good economy, I would like you to go out there the last few days, go out to Ohio and say this, and it'll really help the election move in a direction I think is probably a good idea. Like John Snow saying that the loss of jobs is a myth. We've had a year of pretty good GDP growth. Very good, but not overwhelming. But job growth over the past year has been just kept pace with population growth. And this is not, considering the enormous shortfall, this is nothing to get excited about. And beyond that, there is this question: how are you going to pay for the government? How are you going to pay for the things that people expect the government to do? You have to do it somehow, or you have to cut back sharply on what the government does. Robert, you've written about supporting starve the beast as a doctrine, and which is cut revenues and then we can use that to squeeze down government spending. I'm not in favor of that. I think that the government does important stuff, and I don't think there's a lot of there's this, basically we have this $400 billion deficit. It's not going to go away simply through economic growth. It has to be some combination of either spending cuts or increased revenue. And I don't like these tax cuts, which will eventually force a cut in programs that I think are very important to people's lives.
I don't like everything about the policy programs of the Bush administration, but I try to give them credit for the things that they've done that are good. The economy's grown at almost 5% in real terms over the last 4 or 5 quarters. That really is a very strong performance. The unemployment rate has come down a full percentage point, and that's a good statistic. It's a meaningful number. It means that the labor market is doing better. Investment has been incredibly strong over the last 4 or 5 quarters. And I think some of that has to do with the tax program of 2003. So I think there are a lot of positive things. It was surprising that job growth wasn't stronger earlier on in the recovery. I agree with that was surprising.
And why was
but it
that?
has. Well, I don't think it's completely well understood why. I think it does have something to do with the fact that productivity was growing so rapidly. So that meant that in the short run, that businesses didn't seem to have to hire as many workers as before.
They were acting with more efficiency.
Well, that's clearly true. In terms of the data, the productivity growth has been extremely strong. Now, that was true earlier, but you can see some of that is just in the numbers. If GDP growth is doing pretty well, and the number of people employed is not rising that fast, that has to mean that productivity growth is doing strong. But you might not like that outcome because you want to have more job growth. I understand that.
Let me ask a political question in Ohio. Politically, where there is a serious issue of jobs, yes?
Yes.
Why isn't Senator Kerry way ahead of the president?
Well, we could ask that nationally, but there are other
ask
issues.
it nationally, both times. Tell me, what is it? Is it simply because, as I read the other day and have talked about, and you both know about, the idea that people look at questions of cultural issues versus economic issues, and people seem to be more voting in response to cultural questions than economic questions?
Well, look, truth to be told, I think it's even more, culture is part of it, but national security. I mean, this is an administration that has wrapped itself in the flag over national security issues, and that for a lot of people, if people believe its characterization of itself as we're going to keep you safe, if the question is between the candidate who might do more to help you get a job and the candidate who's going to keep your kids from being killed, people are going to vote for the candidate they think is going to keep them safe. And I think without the national security issue, this would be a blowout for whoever was not in office.
Let me come back to tax cuts. If, in fact, Senator Kerry is elected, and if, in fact, he is able to go forward with his program to roll back tax cuts for those making more than $200,000 a year, what impact do you think it will have on the economy and reducing the deficit?
Well, that in itself would, I think, have a small negative impact, analogous to the kind of effect early on in the Clinton administration where they raised those tax rates, or if you go back to the first Bush administration, there was a similar kind of increase in rates that affected people at the top. It's not going to be a major consequential effect, but it'll be negative. It'll be something slightly adverse for the economy. Unless it's a really big increase, then it would be very negative.
I don't see that there was negative effect from the previous one, but Robert is right, actually. Then it happens.
There will be a negative effect on the economy.
No, but he's right about the scale of it. I don't think it would have a negative effect because I think that we have a problem of demand, not supply, and we have a problem of spending, not incentives. And since, in fact, Kerry is proposing to use the bulk of any additional revenue for new government programs, it doesn't do much for the deficit, actually, but it also doesn't do anything to depress spending. And the point about the scale of it, the scale of what Kerry is proposing is, in fact, almost identical to the Clinton 93 tax increase, which did not exactly sink the U.S. economy. So, you can't make the case that this is a major thing one way or the other.
So what kind of conservative is George Bush?
Well, it's a mixed bag. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think the tax-cutting program, particularly in 2003, was very sound. A lot of conservative has to do with the national security issues, which, as you mentioned, and Paul mentioned, is probably paramount in the election. In other respects, he's not so conservative, particularly on the expenditure side. And this, of course, is not getting into the social conservative issue.
But he's not spending enough to satisfy you.
Well,
Or
the spending
different priorities.
Different priorities. And look, he has not. What I fear politically, not economically, is that the only way to make sense of his tax cuts is eventually to have sharp cuts in social programs, in Social Security and Medicare, which I think are good programs. There's been some runaway spending on a few things, but it's not a big share of what's happened to the budget problem. I just have to say, what kind of conservative, or better, what kind of Republican is Bush? And the answer, of course, is he's a banana Republican. Just look at the fiscal irresponsibility.
What is a banana Republican?
Basically, cut taxes without having any plan to cut spending or any, just let it rip. Somehow or other, financial markets will provide.
You can't go that crazy about the deficit. It's a little over 3% of the GDP now.
That's what they always say. I mean, they make it a percentage of GDP defines that is a more important number than the size of the deficit.
Oh,
agree.
I think everybody would agree that that's the right way
Right.
to look at it. And, maybe that's somewhat too big. I think it's mostly too big because of the expenditure side, lack of discipline. But I don't think that that's a major problem going forward. I don't think that's having any important impact itself on the economy. And the question is, what are you going to do next? And in particular, what are you going to do to promote economic growth? But one thing that I think that Bush would do in a second term, which would fit more into your conservative agenda, would be in terms of having some kind of...
His conservative agenda.
His or anybody's,
a conservative agenda,
would be on the Social Security side in terms of introducing some kind of private accounts. Not changing the pensions for the existing retired people or people close to it, but down the road, people who are younger. Well, that's something that has to be argued out. But, you can imagine going up to somebody in early 40, but that's something you'd have to go through. But the idea would be to have a transition where a lot more in the next generation is going to be in terms of personal accounts rather than the kind of plan that we've had since the 1930s.
Well, I think it's a terrible idea, but even aside from that, it's very expensive. Because the real problem in any of these things is, what about the guy, say somebody, well, my age, your age, we've been paying into the system all our lives. We don't have a private account. Where's the money going to come from to pay for our retirement? And you and I don't need it, but a lot of people do. And you start to say, well, we're going to finesse that. And any way you cut it, you need several $1 trillion of additional money injected into the system to make any of these things work. To cover the transition, I don't think it's a good idea to do it in any case, but to cover this transition for all the people who've been paying into what has been a pay-as-you-go program, where each generation supports the previous generation in its retirement. This has never been explained how it's ever going to work. And it's just the arithmetic. I mean, they had a commission tried to produce plans, and each of the plans they produced had this little asterisk that said funds to be provided from elsewhere, which turned out to be in the trillions of dollars.
I'm surprised you make that argument as an economist. I mean, of course, you have to honor the commitments that you've made in this program to people to pay their pensions. What you have now is a situation where there's a big public debt out there in the form of future Social Security payments. So it's not an official part of the public debt, but it's just like it. And of course, the transition is where you increase the literal debt in order to fund it. You have to borrow, but you're replacing implicit debt, which is the pension payments you're owing, with explicit debt.
Do either of you believe that they will have, whether it's Kerry or Bush, that they will reduce the deficit in half by 2008?
I believe that neither of them has a program to do that.
Right, that's a better answer. Yeah.
Neither of them has a program to do that. Kerry, I believe that if Kerry wins, he actually will, because I actually think that we're going to get a very Clinton-esque team in there. But it's not in the program. Bush, I think, will increase the deficit drastically if he gets a second term.
Well, I don't think that's right. As Paul said before, the thing that really eliminated the deficit in the 90s was the rapid growth of the second half of the 1990s. So the central thing is whether the economy is going to grow well, which I think there's a good chance of that, but I can't be sure of that. And I think that Bush would have a lot more spending restraint in a second term than he had in the first one.
Why do you think that?
Because I think he's done some of these programs that he wanted to do, particularly on education and Medicare. And I think that he's going to go beyond that to maintain more of a balance in the government.
Do you comprehend the Kerry health care plan? I don't mean that in the way it sounds, but he's in love with it.
I'm in love with one piece of it I think is just brilliant, which is the catastrophic health care. The taking up, federalizing most of the cost of catastrophic health expenses is actually a very smart idea.
Is it?
The catastrophic part is the main part where the government should have some involvement. The problem with the current system
is almost insure of last resort, isn't it? A kind of.
Yeah, and the reason why it's so smart is this is a surprisingly large part of healthcare expenses, and insurance companies spend enormous resources trying not to cover those people,
right.
And yet we end up covering them one way or another anyway. So this is just something that actually completely eliminates a lot of waste in the system.
Problem with the current system is we have all this insurance for covering things that are not catastrophic. It's really too much coverage for everything else, and I think that helps to build up the expenditures. But, I mean, Kerry is not very good on the other side in terms of the medical liability problem, particularly since he has a trial lawyer running with him on the ticket. One of the other problems driving up the health care costs is definitely on the malpractice insurance side.
It's a tiny issue that's blown up into something enormous because it suits an ideology. It just is not a big part. Even the insurers say that caps on liability would not do a lot to change the expenses.
Let me ask them, change it finally. You know, I have read, and I don't know the numbers clearly, 44 million Americans are uninsured.
Yes.
That just seems
45,
to me,
I think.
Okay, I said 44, you say 45.
Yeah.
That's incomprehensible to me. I mean, it seems so basic, the necessity to be free from the fear of not being able to have health care. What am I missing? Why am I naive?
Health care is central, and certainly catastrophic insurance coverage is central. But I think one of the problems is we've gotten into this mindset where we think that people should be covered for everything, including all the routine things. And we've expanded the system far too much, mostly based on people getting health insurance coverage through their employers, and we're very much subsidizing that through the tax system. This is a big mistake in how the system is structured. You're sort of used to the idea that everybody's covered for almost everything with respect to health. But that's a mistake.
No, I mean, this is yes, it's crazy. I mean, we are the richest country in the world, and yet there's this enormous insecurity. And it's not always the same 45 million people. Over a 2-year period, it's really about 70 million people who go through some spell of not being covered, and that's a lot of people having terrible anxiety. And this is absurd. This is grossly unfair and one of the incredible failings, and a lot of those people are children.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.